men are murderers, and they have neighbouring cells. For a while, both were treated the same by the guards, and they just tried to keep their heads down. But recently, there's been a change in their circumstances. One of them has started to suffer. The guards keep finding excuses to ransack his cell, looking for contraband. Their handling has gotten rougher. He's beaten often at the slightest excuse. They make his life miserable, treating him like an animal and interrupting him at all times of the day and night. And while all this is happening, he looks at how they've started to deal with his neighbour. They never bothered to search his cell. In fact, they stand and chat and they trade cigarettes and chocolate with him. They seem quite chummy, really. If ever he has to be taken anywhere in handcuffs, they're almost apologetic as they put them on. And then one night, the suffering inmate's jaw drops as he looks at the dry crust of bread that's been thrown on the floor of his cell, and he compares it with the feast that's been wheeled in to his neighbour. Plates heaped with the finest food, lobster, sausages. It's a bit of a dangerous story to tell when you haven't had your supper yet, isn't it? The choicest cuts of steak, caviar, champagne, craft ales, artisan baked cakes and puddings. And this poor hungry man drools in envy as he watches his neighbour stuff his face and thinks desperately that he will give anything in that moment to switch cells. But would that be wise? What I neglected to mention is that while both men were murderers, they're on death row. Only one of them has received a pardon. It's being finalised, it's still being processed, which is why he's still in prison. But the guards are using every opportunity to make this man suffer before he's released. The other man has received an execution date. And so the guards were being polite. They didn't feel the need to get their own rough justice when a lethal injection will soon do that work for them. When God's people suffer, we're tempted to look at the wicked and envy what they have. I want us all to realise tonight that what an unbeliever has is, at best, a last meal before execution. We're to persevere knowing that our pardon has been issued and we are just waiting to be released. In these verses, as Peter brings his teaching on suffering to a close, he contrasts these two groups of people, believers and unbelievers, or what he terms God's house and the ungodly. Let's start by thinking about God's house, because Peter is still here helping Christians understand their suffering in the correct light. Because we look at our own suffering or the suffering of other Christians, and if we're believers, we're inclined to see it, aren't we, as a sign of God's punishment. Fair or unfair. It might be, well, of course, I'm suffering because I did this thing wrong, or I'm suffering and I don't know why, it doesn't seem fair. I've not done anything to deserve it. Or even, given how successful non-Christians can be, we might see it as evidence of the failure of God's justice. But Peter makes clear in verse 17 the principle that God's justice starts at home. Now, Peter's building on everything that he's already said in this letter about the church being God's spiritual temple, literally house, in chapter 2, verse 5. The church is the temple of God. I was praying it and saying it before. We are the house of God. It's not the building, it's the people. We are the sacred space. We are God's house, and that isn't just the building, it's his family. And it's a clear biblical teaching that God's people, this goes way back to the Old Testament, God's people, his chosen, are held to a higher standard than anyone else because they have a higher purpose than anyone else. In a particular way, God's chosen people are to represent him to the world. And so that means that they are going to be judged in a way according to a higher standard because the stakes are higher, the responsibilities higher. The nature of our relationship with God and the revelation that we've received give us a particular responsibility. I don't know if you ever got upset, well, I certainly did, as a child, when you were out somewhere and you may be getting told off by your parents, and then you see some other child misbehaving in an equal or lesser, or equal or worse way, and they get away with it. And it seems unjust, doesn't it? So what do your parents say when you protest it? They say, well, they're not my child. You are. Or they say, I'll not have a daughter of mine behaving like that. See, family identity gives responsibilities as well as privileges, doesn't it? Like, if you're going to be part of this family, then you have to act like it. But the main takeaway from this should be tonight that when God's people suffer more than anyone else, it's not a sign of God's abandonment, but of his special attention. And we've talked about this as we've gone through 1 Peter. In a way, if we're suffering for being Christian, that shouldn't surprise us in a world order which is in rebellion against God. If we're on one side and all the people on the other side are attacking us, that shouldn't surprise us, should it? But I think this is wider. We can't forget everything, can we, that Peter's already taught us about the value of suffering, how it's a refining process, a discipling process. It's a mark of God's delight in his beloved children who he has honoured by giving them the privilege of bearing and suffering in his name. The author of Hebrews in chapter 12 says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children." God's discipline, whether that's a rebuke or a guiding hand leading us away from sin, and we talk about discipline and we tend to only think about the smack, the spare the rod and spoil the child. But it's not only sort of the corrective discipline, is it? It's the formative discipline. You know, you get your child up in the morning. Why? Because they need to go to school. That's discipline. You're training them how to live. It's positive as well as negative. The discipline that God calls us to is a sign of our legitimacy as his children. You know, when you see those two kids misbehaving, one of them gets told off by their parent, the other one doesn't, because it's not their child. The Lord disciplines those he loves. But Peter also backs up this principle by quoting from Proverbs. If you were to look up that chapter, you might have the footnote in there. And you'd see many similar proverbs. Often, in the book of Proverbs, you've got similar proverbs. They get kind of lumped together or categorized together. And these many proverbs remind us that the success of the wicked is temporary. See, the Bible never says that wicked people can't prosper in this life. It says that's not a way to show success, wickedness, but it's a tension that the Bible deals with. Wicked people seem to get ahead in life. That's one of the things Job talks about. He can't get his head around it. He's like, tell me this. How come it is that the wicked do all right and me, a righteous man, I lose everything? But Proverbs tells us, as the rest of the Bible does, that the success of the wicked is temporary. And God's justice is certain. They remind us of God's way of doing things in this life. And as he says, it is hard for the righteous to be saved. Now, this is easily misunderstood. It doesn't mean that our salvation isn't certain. We don't even know if we're going to get saved. That's not what Peter's saying. Like the Lord Jesus said, how hard it is for a rich man to be saved. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. And they said, this is incredible because the rich people have been blessed by God because they must be righteous people. And if it's hard for them to be saved, how can we be saved? He said, with man, it's impossible, but with God, it's possible. So we're not saved by our hard work. We're saved by God's grace. But the hardness is not the difficulty we have to put in order to get saved. It's a reminder that the destination, or the road to our final destination, is a hard one. It's not talking about the effort we put in, but the experience we have. We can hardly walk in the footsteps of a suffering Saviour and complain when the road which takes us past Calvary is a difficult one. Like Jesus says in Matthew 7, small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life. Judgment starts at home. We suffer by the will of a loving Father who is holding us to a higher standard than the people around us, who is training us in holiness and preparing us to live with him forever. What are we being refined to? Something so much higher and so much greater than anyone else in this world. God is working in us in such a slow way, it seems, but such a sure way. Teaching us, training us, working these providences in our life, just the situations of our life, and controlling all in such a way that he will develop character in us that will last into eternity. Those who are, by grace, members of God's house should see their suffering for what it is and learn from it. That's God's house. Well, what about this comparison? The ungodly. That's the same comparison that comes up in Proverbs 11, the ungodly. But we see non-Christians going from strength to strength despite their blatant sin. And perhaps we do start to doubt God's justice, just like Job. It's a perfectly natural response, isn't it, in our weakness. But Peter reminds us, as a shocking contrast, what their ultimate reward is. Now, living in the world, I'll admit, it's often very hard to have a perspective that extends beyond the passing life. We live in this world, don't we? It is natural to have our attention fixed on it. This is just, what else can we think about? Imagine being a tadpole living in a pond. And you could know, you've been told in tadpole school, so you know intellectually that there is a world outside of the pond you live in. but you can't see it because the light reflects off the underside of the surface like a mirror. The pond is all you've ever known. So even if a frog came from outside of the pond to explain to you what life was going to be like after you yourself become a frog, you'll struggle to believe it and make decisions as if you believed it. Because in a way, the idea that one day you'll go beyond that shiny, reflective surface and you'll kind of walk around in this strange thing called air, how can you get your head around that? It's just so far beyond your experience. You can't, can you? It's the same way for us as believers trying to think beyond this life. Because when it comes to justice, we can envy the wicked because some of them seem to gain through their wickedness the very things that our righteousness seems to deprive us of. Fortune, friends, fame. And, it's tempting to see that some of those things, that's a very worldly set of values, but we all want to prosper. We all want to be loved. We all want to be known as good people. We don't want people to hate us. Some people don't care much what people think about them, but if you care at all, you don't want to be despised. It's just natural. That's the way God's made us as social beings. And if this life is all there is, if there's nothing beyond the pond, then righteousness, which loses you out on fame and fortune and friends, if there's nothing beyond the pond, righteousness is folly. It's madness. You have to have your head examined for acting in such a way that you just lose out on the only thing that there is, on the only life there is. But we're believers here tonight, aren't we? And we know that there is a world outside of this pond that we call life. All those who've pretended against the voice of their own conscience that there are no consequences to their actions are storing up a weight of judgment that is terrifying to consider. And it's been wisely said. I remember being at a conference and it was Professor Dan Strange talking about it, saying that one response, when people say, why is there suffering in the world? And one response is that it's because of God's grace. That there is judgment stored up. And it's like one of those awnings on a market stall. If you go to town on a Thursday, see those few that are left. And then the rain fills it up. And it just gets heavier and heavier. But as it fills, these little drops of water come down, don't they? And that's like what our suffering is like. We're there in the world and we get these drops of suffering come down and they can feel terrible. But they're a reminder of the danger that is coming. They are a warning of the judgment to come. They are telling us all, make sure that you get out from under that tarpaulin before it comes down. Because if you think these drops are bad, you have no idea. It is a sign of God's grace that He would send even suffering to warn us of the judgment to come so that we may escape it. What are you expecting when this passing world is done? Are you prepared for the unending life or the unending death that comes after this life? Because our wishful thinking or our attempt to ignore it will not change the reality that looms above us. I think it's remarkable that one distinct comparison of the Bible, look at verse 17 here, seems to be two things that aren't really opposites. The Bible does this sometimes. It contrasts here faith and disobedience. This is something I think that's already come up in Peter. Faith and disobedience. Now we see, in the Western world anyway, we see faith as a kind of intellectual exercise to do with learning and believing certain statements. And we think that faith naturally contrasts with unbelief. Faith or belief, you could call it that. What's the opposite of that? Well, unbelief. You either say yes to a statement or you say no. It's like you believe it or you don't believe it. And separate to this whole issue, we see obedience or disobedience. Whether it's obedience to God's law or disobedience to God's law, or any law. You obey the law of the land or you disobey it. And we've kind of got these as like separate bars. You've got a faith-ometer and you've got an obedience-ometer, and never the two shall meet. But the Bible contrasts faith with disobedience as a hint in here of what the Bible means when it talks about faith. And it's not exactly what we mean when we talk about faith. Let me try and simplify things. A person is saved when they hear the gospel and believe in Jesus. Okay, I'm not preaching any new gospel here tonight. Believe, but then obedience is the natural product. And it's natural to talk about this as obeying the gospel, because that's what he says, obeying the gospel of God. That's what salvation is. It's obeying the gospel of God. We're not saved by works, we're saved by faith. Saved by grace through faith, not by works. And yet he says, those who have obeyed the gospel. That's Christians. That's what it means to be saved. You've obeyed the gospel. And he's not saying you've done it perfectly. He's not saying you've lived a perfectly righteous life, because that's not what Peter believes salvation is. He's already told us. I go back to chapter 1 or chapter 2. Reflect on what salvation is. It's grace. And yet he talks about faith as obeying the gospel. Because faith is submitting to the lordship of Christ in every area of life. Faith and obedience are not two different things, two different categories. They are one and the same. Believing loyalty, you could call it. The Bible contrasts this believing loyalty, this obedient faith, with those who hear the gospel and don't believe it, and therefore are disobedient because they don't submit to the God who created them. So and I don't think this is the case for most of us here tonight, but if you hear the gospel that Jesus Christ is Lord and you don't believe it, the problem isn't that you've not been provided with enough evidence. Because that's what some people do, say, like, look, I'll believe Jesus is the Lord if you can prove it. They're liars. The problem is not a question of evidence. The problem is that you are a sinner who is disobeying God, and unless you repent and plead mercy from this God, then you will receive the judgment that any rebel could expect from a sovereign ruler. But this contrast, and this terrible contrast between the godly and the ungodly, the house of God and the disobedient sinner, is not given to make us despise them. It is given to encourage suffering Christians. That suffering we experience causes us to envy the wicked. But Peter's saying, don't envy them. Pity them. If you think your life is hard, look at where they're going. We need to see our suffering for what it is, in the framework that God graciously gives us. But we need to see their apparent success for what it is. To an unbeliever, this life, with all its vanities, is the best it will ever get. And like we've been reflecting, life is short. What a terrible thing to think that this is it. To a believer, this life is the worst things will ever be, with only glory ahead. Or I think of one of your best days. I think that is a bad day compared to what is to come. You know, the birth of your first child, the birth of your first grandchild. Some of the best days we might have in life. It is nothing compared to the glory that will be revealed in us when Jesus returns or calls us home. We should pray with humility and trembling and fall on our knees in gratitude at everything Christ Jesus has saved us from, and pray desperately for those just standing, uncaring, under the judgment that will one day fall on them. Let's finish by looking at verse 19. Because Peter's summary solution to Kristian's suffering is simple. I'm reflecting on when I wrote that a few years ago. That's a lot of S's, isn't it? Which is a hard letter for me to say. Peter's summary solution to Kristian's suffering is simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. Christians suffering in the world should not envy the wicked. They should imitate Christ. I love that. It's another wonderful non sequitur in a way, isn't it? It doesn't quite follow on. You would expect him to say, don't envy the wicked, rejoice in your salvation. He says, don't envy the wicked, imitate Christ. This solution, this exhortation, he says, commit yourself to your faithful Creator and continue to do good. You know, continue in this Christ imitation he's talked about. Commit yourselves to your faithful Creator and continue to do good. Don't envy them. Do good. This is the thing that marks out Christians from non-Christians. We imitate Christ. And it's not because, as we've said, that we think Christ-like behaviour will earn us a place in heaven. We know that that's not how it works. It can't. We would never be good enough off our own bat to get into heaven. We imitate Christ because we trust him, and because we rely on him, and because we love him for what he's done for us. And so we commit ourselves to our faithful Creator. That means we leave things in his hands. Like Jesus on the cross, like Stephen, the first martyr, we commit ourselves to our faithful Creator. Like they said, into your hands I commit my spirit. It's like saying, Lord, I give myself to you, I trust you. We don't need to try to tear down the wicked ourselves. We don't need to try to get even. We can leave it to God because we trust him. He's the judge. He's a perfect judge. He won't make mistakes like we do. You ever lost your temper at someone thinking they've done something wrong? And you're wrong, aren't you? You've blamed them for something they haven't done. God never does that. He's the perfect judge. And God is described here as Creator because suffering Christians, perhaps more than ever, need to remember the power and authority of the God who has called them. As we are suffering, as we are asking, why? Why would God allow this? Why would God cause them to thrive and us to suffer? And we need to remember he is a faithful Creator. He made the world. Do we not think he knows what he's doing? This is a God who can and will call the wicked to account. This is a God who is reliable. This is a God who can bring a rainbow through the rain, who can bring salvation out of suffering. And so we need to carry on, continuing to to do the good things that Peter has already described in this letter. The Christ-imitating works of service, however little reward we might seem to receive in this life, at least according to the values of the world. Because we trust that God holds us safely and can use even our suffering and even the injustice of it to draw us nearer to him. Don't envy the wicked their last meal. We know that our Creator is a God of justice. And he, through the blood of Christ, has written our pardon. However much we might suffer because of that, every act of hatred against us, for his sake, is a reminder of the blessing that we have, of the hope we're looking forward to, that drives us back to the God who has saved us and will save us at the end. Can we learn God's plan and purpose for our suffering? Can we learn his way of doing things? And can we learn to obey, persevere, and continue to do good? Let's sing our final hymn, number 366. Glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion, city of our God. I choose this all the time, I know, but I make no apologies. Fading is the worldling's pleasure, all his boasted pomp and show, solid joys and lasting treasure, none but Zion's children know. Let's stand and sing.